conference's main focus on fake news. So the question behind it is if misinformation pervades democracies, what does normative political philosophy have to say about it? In other words, should we worry about the bullshitted, to quote someone from this morning session? So I want to examine whether democracy requires some form of epistemic equality between members of a political community. And I take it for granted that democracy entails some form of democratic equality, that is, the equal share of control, of political control among members. And so my question is, does democratic equality necessarily translate into or require a form of epistemic equality between those members? And what motivates this question is that some political philosophers have recently argued that the fact that citizens' political judgments are not similarly informed, consistent, and well-considered constitutes a compelling reason against democratic equality and democracy altogether. So these philosophers endorse what you can call an instrumental view of political legitimacy. They take political institutions and regimes to be legitimate insofar as they result in substantively good policies. So the argument developed in this paper is an attempt to counter the anti-democratic conclusion from instrumentalism. But it also departs from opposite non-instrumental conceptions according to which epistemic inequalities do not affect democratic equality and are irrelevant to the kind of respect persons are owed qua citizens. So what I would like to show is that democratic equality does require that citizens be equally in a position to express informed, well-considered political judgments, and that epistemic equality matters for non-instrumental reasons. So it's not required as a condition for democracy to result in good outcomes, but by virtue of citizens' democratic agency. Okay, so this is the outline of the presentation. So, I take epistemic equality to refer to citizens' equal capability for judgment in the political domain, and to the subsequent equal epistemic worth of political judgments. So by epistemic worth, I do not mean the truth value of political judgments. I mean that they result from a reflective process that involves the gathering, interpretation, and assessment of information, and its integration into a moral and deliberation on appropriate reasons for reasons for pursuing given courses of action or endorsing specific political principles. So a judgment is political when A, it bears on a matter that is or should be of interest to the general public, for instance, abortion, a political platform, sustainable energy, and B, when it includes a distinctive evaluative or prescriptive component. So it is a view on what ought collectively to be done. And thirdly, a political judgment is not necessarily disinterested. It's not necessarily a disinterested view on what justice requires. But as opposed to brute preference, in forming a political judgment, the citizen expresses her view in a reflective way. So a political judgment is grounded in evidence and information and reasons. Now, in certain epistemic justifications of democracy, the equal capability of citizens to express informed and considered political opinions, so epistemic equality, does appear as a condition, as a democratic requirement. So what are epistemic justifications of democracy? Well, these claim that democratic decision-making displays specific features, inclusiveness, equality, public deliberation, majority rule, etc. And because it displays such features, it is more likely in certain circumstances, at least, to yield substantively good results. And it's more likely to do so than autocratic regimes or rule by experts. And so in some of these epistemic conceptions, epistemic equality is the basis of democratic equality, so it is what justifies equal share of power in the first place. And as a consequence, it is an absolute requirement for democracy and for democratic legitimacy. So this is quite clear, for instance, from Condorcet's jury theorem and political writings. Condorcet's epistemic defense of democracy rests on the assumption of epistemic equality, understood as equal epistemic quality. So Condorcet claims that under certain circumstances, members of the political community are equally good, if fallible, judges on political matters. And consequently, under certain circumstances, again, the opinion of the many can be reliable evidence for what ought collectively to be done. So that's the jury theorem. Epistemic arguments for democracy thus seem to make a strong case for democracy, or they make the case for democracy stronger. They show that, granted that members of the political community are epistemic equals, democratic decision-making is the most rational method for determining collective decisions. So without necessarily committing ourselves to a fully epistemic justification of democracy, we might want to be able to appeal to these epistemic arguments, along with others, when it comes to justifying democracy. And so in this regard, it's worth noting that the epistemic case for democracy is per se only instrumental. For Condorcet, the majority has a legitimate claim to rule only insofar as citizens are indeed epistemic equals. In other words, the strength of the epistemic case for democracy crucially depends on the effectivity of epistemic equality. So the next obvious question for us is the assumption of epistemic equality justified? You saw me coming. Empirical studies suggest that it is not. Political science surveys have repeatedly shown that a vast majority of voters is ignorant of the basic workings of their democracy, as well as of national and global political issues. So, for example, they tend to systematically overestimate the percentage of people on welfare or the share represented by foreign aid in the federal budget. That's an American example. And these studies show also that there are actually wide discrepancies in political knowledge between social groups. So members of the socio-economic elite show a high degree of political awareness and are often highly involved in politics, while members of disadvantaged groups tend to be comparatively much less informed and involved in politics. So instead of epistemic equality, what we have are modern democracies saturated with epistemic inequalities and a generally low level of political competence. So the difficulty this poses for democratic theorists may be described as a subcategory of the Singer problem, and I'm quoting Richard Arnson here. So Peter Singer shows that claims to equality among members of any group must refer to at least one common distinctive feature, so capacity, physical appearance, that is not displayed by non-members. Typically, human equality is supposed to be grounded in shared distinctive features, such as rational and moral capacities. But the Singer problem is that any attempt to base the claim of human equality on the actual equality between people is vulnerable to the absence of guarantee that these abilities are distributed evenly, to quote Singer. To give an obvious example, infants and mentally handicapped people, severely handicapped persons, are not capable of rational and moral reasoning to the same degree as Peter Singer. So since the abilities supposed to ground human equality actually vary significantly among humans, the conclusion of Singer is that partisans of human equality are forced to draw the non-egalitarian conclusion that human beings have different value or status depending on the degree to which they display their relevant capacities. So we can see a parallel here with democratic equality. The same problem arises. So if it is true, as some epistemic arguments for democracy suggest, that democratic equality rests on epistemic equality, that is, if it is true that the equal share of political power, of political control, springs from the equal capability to exert that power and is justified by it, then the fact that citizens are not equal judges in political matters should also call into question the legitimacy of their equal share of political control in the first place. So the claim to democratic equality has no actual ground. That's our problem. And indeed, some philosophers have recently argued that epistemic inequality justifies political inequality. That's the case of Richard Anson here, and also Jason Brennan, more recently, has defended epistocracy, or expert rule, on the ground that unequal political competence disqualifies democracy as a way of distributing power. So Brennan holds competence to be a presumptive condition of the right to rule, and so he claims that epistemically unequal citizens are not equally entitled to shape the course of collective affairs. It is permissible, according to him, to exclude individuals showing a poor political judgment from the right to exercise political power over others. Okay, so democratic theorists have come up with two main responses to the objection from epistemic inequality. And both responses insist that citizens' epistemic inequality is not a decisive obstacle to their equal participation in political control. And this is so because democracy, in fact, does not require epistemic equality between citizens. So I'll try to show why this line of reasoning appears to me to be mistaken before trying to suggest another response in the final section. So the first response is to deny that a citizen's general ability to judge correctly about political matters can be assessed. This could be so for various reasons. First, political judgments bear on complex and multi-dimensional issues, so they intertwine the interpretation of a great number of facts with moral deliberation. Second, political matters often regard the distribution of benefits and burdens, and so judgments on these matters are also often tainted by cognitive biases and personal perspectives. So it's very implausible that a general test for sound political judgment could be designed that would not reproduce its designer's moral views and biases. Actually, it's an objection that has been made against measures of political competence by political scientists. These measures have been said to reflect a cognitivist approach to competence, which reduces politics to a kind of knowledge to the detriment of its practical dimensions. And thirdly, the soundness of our political judgments greatly varies depending on the context and the political matter at hand. So in interpersonal relationships, it might be possible to identify certain individuals as having professed good or poor political judgment on a given occasion, but this does not give us the reliable basis for a public system of discrimination between citizens qua judges. So given these difficulties, the first response claims that epistemic equality must be publicly assumed in the distribution of political power, because any claim to epistemic superiority is vulnerable to immediate and endless contestation. So one possible concern with this response is that its defense of democratic equality rests merely on a practical impossibility. So it's probably right that no reliable public test for measuring the quality of citizens' political judgments would ever be conceivable. But if such a test were available, or even just a more reliable method for making collective decisions that was based on an unequal distribution of political control, if that was available, nothing in this response indicates that we should nevertheless stick to democratic equality. So such a defense of democracy might seem both fragile and unsatisfactory. So the second response avoids this consequence by insisting on the intrinsic value of democratic equality. It has notably been offered by Jeremy Waldron, and it states that epistemic inequalities among citizens are irrelevant to the claim of democratic equality because granting citizens equal control over collective affairs is a matter of respect for their basic equality as persons. So by virtue of this principle, respect for the basic equality of persons, no fundamental distinction, says Waldron, may be established between human persons, at least when moral justification is at stake. So what does it mean? Well, it means that citizens, what Waldron calls their conditional status in society, so for instance their occupation, their social position, this conditional status is likely to be influenced by their differing abilities, skills, achievements, etc. But as persons, they are owed a kind of respect that is not proportional to their merit or ability. They enjoy equal social status, that is, equal dignity. So the second response to the objection from epistemic inequality is that it rests on a category mistake. It treats citizens' democratic prerogatives as a conditional status, whereas it's a social status inherently attached to their dignity as persons. So as an expression of the equal dignity of persons, democratic equality is intrinsically valuable and it does not depend on epistemic equality. So you might want to ask why should democratic equality be a matter of respect for the equal dignity of persons rather than a matter of appraisal of citizens' varying merit? In particular of their abilities as judges in political matters? Well, the answer Waldron gives is that it's because of the particular nature of political problems. So to the extent that these problems affect us all, they require that we not give decisive importance to differences of ability between individuals, including differences in their ability to make political judgments when we determine how to face these problems. My issue with this response is that epistemic abilities are in fact extremely relevant to the claim of democratic equality in Waldron's argument. The principle that all persons should equally enjoy control over the determination of their collective affairs is grounded in the recognition of the specific status of persons as democratic agents, that is, as agents that are equally capable of judgment and action in the affairs that concern them. So it's true that respect for the basic equality of person is not proportional to merit or ability, but it's still commanded by virtue of specific abilities that are considered fundamental characteristics of persons, namely their rational and moral agency. So it's not absolutely true. It's not only the political nature of issues that justifies that every member of the political community be given an equal say in their resolution, because non-human animals and ecosystems are affected by the consequences of political decisions and actions as well. Yet it's not failing to show them equal respect, not to grant them the opportunity to have an equal part in their determination, as as the poster from the Parti Animaliste clearly says here. By contrast, as Waldron emphasizes, but elsewhere, because a person is able to form a considered view, on what needs to be done, refusing her any control on the matter would simply be to deny her status as an active thinking being. So here, capacity for judgment clearly serves as the distinctive standard for the allocation of political control in Waldron's argument, because its possession determines whether beings are only affected subjects, so they are as such entitled to equal treatment, or also agents acting in their own name, and only in the latter case is the claim to an equal share of political control justified. So in this sense, democratic equality does presuppose citizens' epistemic equality. So there's a fallback solution for the supporters of the second response, and it's to argue that democratic agency and the claim to an equal share of political control are indeed grounded in the ability to judge and act for oneself, but that citizens' equality, epistemic equality, ought simply to be assumed out of respect for them, for citizens. For instance, this is the position of Melissa Schwarzberg, who defends a principle of equal epistemic respect, according to which equal respect for citizens entails the presumption that citizens' judgments are of equal merit. So, note that the presumption of citizens' epistemic equality does not result from the practical undecidability of political claims to epistemic superiority, as it was in the first response. Schwarzberg claims that even if an adequate or generally acceptable test for the soundness of political judgments could be designed, insofar as we are democrats, we should not want to assign unequal political power on that basis. Instead, what we should do is presume citizens' epistemic equality and disregard any test or evidence that would suggest otherwise. So we should put into brackets or abstain from measuring existing inequalities of political judgments between people. Why? Well, out of respect for their equality as democratic agents. So a difficulty, it seems to me, with this response is that in the face of clear existing epistemic inequalities, simply to presume epistemic equality in the name of equal respect might appear self-contradictory. So, of course, in these arguments, abstaining from measuring epistemic inequality is a way to ensure equal citizenship, to ensure an equal share of political control or power to all. But it could also be argued that to claim that equality is required and yet ignore its absence or dismiss its absence as irrelevant is not a consistent way of expressing respect for persons. So if the presumption of epistemic equality results in the overlook of citizens' unequal access to information and uneven mastery of various useful resources to the adequate formation of political judgments, then it could actually be seen as a lack of respect. At the very least, it makes citizens' democratic equality only formal. So one could argue that respect for citizens as democratic agents would call for more than a presumption of their epistemic equality. It would involve actual assurance that they are all equally in a position to make sound judgments on collective affairs. So that's why I think there is a more promising response to the objection from inequality. And this response admits from the start that epistemic equality grounds the recognition of citizens' democratic agency. So democratic equality indeed requires that citizens be roughly epistemic equals. That is, that their political judgment be of roughly equal epistemic worth. But it goes on to claim that this calls for the realization of epistemic equality rather than for its mere presupposition. So if democratic agency is grounded on the ability to judge and act for oneself, then democratic equality requires that citizens as democratic agents be equally in a position to exert that ability. So, by admitting that democratic equality requires epistemic equality, am I committing to an instrumental and hence conditional defense of democracy? And more importantly, am I opening the door to the anti-democratic argument according to which when vast inequalities exist between citizens, democracy isn't justified and should just give way to expert rule, to epistocracy? No. No. Why? Well, what differentiates my position from instrumental approaches to democracy is its insistence on the principle of democratic agency. So anti-democrats like Brennan are led to the epistocratic conclusion because they deem it permissible to assign permanently differentiated statuses to people on the basis of the differing degrees to which they are able to form political judgments. So, to push it a little bit, Brennan doesn't say it like this, but it really looks like the politically competent should be recognized as agents, entitled to take part in the shaping of collective affairs, while those whose political judgments are ill-informed, irrational, or inconsistent ought to be granted the status of subjects. So they are entitled to equal treatment, but not to the right to rule. So in other words, anti-democrats deny the principle of democratic agency. They don't think that people are equally capable of judging and acting for themselves. They don't think that they share this ability as a common basic characteristic. The fundamental flaw with this argument is that it takes existing differences in accuracy or rationality between political judgments to be a sufficient condition for granting their holders differentiated statuses and rights. So even assuming that these differences were measurable, to base an epistocratic distribution of political power on them amounts to essentializing de facto differences. So the argument, the anti-democrat argument, misrepresents what is often the result of social institutions and contingent circumstances, unequal access to education, information, political influence, etc., as a kind of natural necessity. So I don't think that stupidity, to quote a concept this morning, is always or even just primarily natural. So by contrast to this anti-democratic position, the view I defend does not understand epistemic equality as a fact, the absence of which would justify replacing democracy with a political rule more likely to yield good outcomes. Instead, it understands epistemic equality as a moral claim against which social facts ought to be evaluated. So epistemic equality is a requirement of democratic equality in the sense that all citizens have a claim to the same epistemic resources, education, information, access, etc., and epistemic capabilities that are necessary to form sound political judgments. And this is so because, contrary to what anti-democrats contend, we have no good reason to think that agency is a trait that some people permanently displayed and not others. And so we have no good reason to renounce our commitment to the principle of democratic agency. However, we do have good reasons to think from political and social sciences studies that the mastery and development of such abilities depend a great deal on the varying social circumstances citizens find themselves in. So consequently, ensuring the equal realization of these abilities is part of the democratic equality requirement. And so, and this will be my conclusion, in the face of, facing evidence of democracies failing to meet this requirement, the normative consequence to draw does not have to be that we should replace democracy with epistocracy. It could be that democratic theory must conceive of ways for democratic states to meet their specific conditions of legitimacy, namely realizing democratic agency.